What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and today we're going to be going over frame advantage and disadvantage within our fighting game tutorial series. So specifically, we're going to be going over displaying it to the HUD so that we can see what our advantage and disadvantage was during practice or training mode. So if we come in here, watch our stage intro, character entrances, get to our training mode, you'll see that we had this frame data panel that I added, which shows the damage, stun frame, startup, active recovery frames, and now I've added frame advantage. This will of course tell you the actual frame advantage of the move. For those of you that are not familiar with frame advantage and disadvantage, it is the process of one character performing an attack, and when they land the attack, the opponent that got hit goes into one type of stun. They either will go into hit stun or block stun depending on what they did. If they did not block the hit, they go into hit stun. If they block the hit, they go into block stun. These are mechanics we've covered throughout the series. If the attacker returns to the idle animation and can move freely before the character that was hit returns to the idle animation and can move freely, they have advantage on hit or advantage on block, because they are able to act before the character that was hit by the attack. However, it is possible if the character hit by the attack actually returns to idle and can move freely before the attacker, in which case the attacker then has disadvantage on hit or block because the character they hit recovers before them. Now with this, technically we have several active frames, so when the red hitbox is up, those are active frames. Currently in the series, we do have a way to track and check for collision at different frames, so it doesn't always have to be on the initial hit. But for the most part, we only use we call it check collision after the hitbox is spawned on its first frame. So we're going to be going off that basis to determine our frame advantage and disadvantage. Just note that we are going to be using the actual recovery frames within the data table that we had to determine the advantage and disadvantage, so it might be a frame or two off depending on where the character was hit during the active frame. Now, with all that explained, we can go ahead and do it. So when I use an attack, I was tracking the startup, active, and recovery frames. As you can see in the top left over player 1's head, as long as I set them up in the data table, they will show up in this section. So when I use my attack on my first character here, you'll see that the startup frames, active frames, recovery frames in the frame data panel, right here where the mouse is, will show up. And so for this attack, I have 55 startup, 36 active, 34 recovery. Now these are pretty long. Usually in fighting games they're going to be really short, but again, these are just the animations I'm working with, and since they're from Mixamo, they happen to be a little bit longer than your typical fighting game animation, but the process is exactly the same. Now, the second player on the right, has not attacked, so they have no data currently. When they attack, their data will also be filled out. Now, frame advantage will only occur on a hit or a block. So, if I now land the hit against my opponent, you can see I have 11 frames of advantage for the attacker. Mathematically, we can determine why the frame advantage on player 1 is 11. This is because if you look at the stats on the frame data panels, I'll crouch both characters so you can see them. The recovery frames for the attacker was 34, so the player on the left had 34 recovery frames when performing this attack. The character on the right now has stun frames filled out because they were stunned for 45 frames based on that hitbox. When that hitbox landed, they were stunned for 45 frames. So, if you take the stun frames of the character that was attacked, 45, and subtract the number of recovery frames from the attacker, which is 34, you'll get 11 frames. Let's take a look at a character if they block. So if the second character goes into the blocking state and we attack them, then the attacker only has a 6 frame advantage. And we can do the math yet again. So if we take the hit character's stun frames, which is 40, and subtract the attacking character's recovery frames, which is 34, we'll get a frame advantage of 6. The attacker will recover 6 frames prior to the character that blocked the attack. All of this is being calculated by our mutant hitbox data and mutant command data. So our hitboxes have a number of stun frames, and so for my first attack, the attack I've been using for this scenario, I have 40 block stun frames and 45 hit stun frames. So if I were to change these, for example, and I would stun the character for less time. Let's say the hit stun time is only 13 frames. Let's play the game one more time. Not versus. Let's go into practice. If I land a hit on my opponent, I have a negative 21 frame advantage, or I have a 21 frame disadvantage on hit. Because as I hit this opponent, they recover very quickly compared to me. You can even see in the animation, the character that is being attacked is recovering prior to the character that is using the attack. The stun animation of that character ends before the character returns back to idle. And that's really what we're going for here. So everyone, before we get started on this episode, I'd love to give a huge shout out to my Patreon members and supporters and YouTube membership subscribers. Thank you guys for all you've done. I really appreciate it. I'm really grateful. I'm so excited to bring you a new episode every week. It is incredibly fun to do. Now to get started on this episode, if you want to get caught up in the series, feel free to click on this iCard in the top right corner right here. This is a link to the Fighting Game Tutorial Series playlist, so you can see everything that we've done to reach this point. And you can follow it along all the way to the most current episode of the Fighting Game Tutorial as well. Alternatively, if you just care about frame advantage, frame disadvantage, then I will link you to this episode right here, which is where we initially set up this widget for the active and stun frames. That sort of stuff is still really useful for this. In fact, we're going to be using that data that we have in the calculations for the frame advantage and frame disadvantage today. So I would recommend watching them before you watch this episode. Alright, so let's go ahead and get started. Now, it's going to be a pretty simple episode in terms of actual implementation today. We are going to want to go to our frame data panel widget. And the frame data panel widget is this one here. So on our HUD, we have two of these in the practice mode. We have our data for all of our fields here, as well as the corresponding value. So if we go to the HUD, you'll see that we have two of these right here. So that's the widget that we want to go to and change. We don't have to do anything on the HUD. I'm just showing you that's the one that we're dealing with. So whatever you called this, I called mine frame data panel. We want to go here and we want to add a field for frame advantage, as well as, of course, give it a value that we can display to the user. You can do this however you want. You can call it whatever you want, but I'll show you what I did for mine. So I have a text box that it just says frame advantage. Here are my values. You can pause it or slow it down if you want to look at them, use them. That is up to you. I have another text box that represents the value of the advantage or disadvantage. And all that actually says is 0 by default. But you can give it a default value. The main reason I haven't is because I actually did not bind this function. I'm going to show you two methods of calculating the advantage and disadvantage. One is binding the value of the text to the actual mathematical result. But the other one is going to be only calling the function to determine this when a character takes damage, which will be a little bit better for performance and also won't have the numbers jumping around and changing so much. So since I did not bind this text, I don't want to have it displayed as a default of something like -2 or +4, because if I do those, then when I go into the game, they're going to start out on that value, and we don't want that. We want it to be 0 by default. So for any of these values that you don't actually bind, you do want to set them to their default value in the widget here. Take a look at the rest of that if you want. So I have two variables here. I have my frame advantage title, which was this, and my frame advantage text, which was this. Make sure your frame advantage text is a variable, because if you're not binding it, we are going to want to be able to grab it and use it in the graph. So just make sure this box is checked. Now, if you do want to bind it, I'll show you what happens. Like I said, I'm showing you two methods today, so we're not going to get them confused. Let's start with the first one. Let's start with the binding, and I'll show you why I decided against going that route, but it's not a problem if you want to use it. I just think it's a little bit less convenient. What I'm going to do is disable my actual logic that I'm using right now, and I'm going to go to my frame advantage text, and I want to bind the text to, I'm going to create a binding if this is the first time I'm doing it, and that will automatically make one for you and bring you to the graph. Because I've already done that, I'm going to go to this one that I've made, get frame advantage text, and it will look like this when I'm done with it. If you go into the graph now and go to the function that was made, this is what I have for that binding. I renamed it because it's like get underscore frame advantage text underscore 0. So I just renamed it to this, but you should have basically what I have here. Then you'll have a node for the actual start of the function, and then you'll have a return node. The rest of this is stuff that I added in here. Now, I will be going through it really quickly, but just know it's basically the exact same as our other functions, our other bindings that we made for this frame data panel widget. So the startup frames, the active frames, the recovery frames. You can copy any of these, go over to your get frame advantage text and paste it in here, and you'll be pretty close. However, so that we understand exactly what's going on, I'm going to go over it. So I have a game mode reference that we set up in event construct of the widget. And this gets the current game mode. We want the game mode because we can grab both player 1 and player 2's data. We're going to need that because we're going to need their stun frames and their recovery frames for the last move or last bit of damage that they took. So I get my game mode reference. I convert it to a validated get. I drag off of it and grab player 1, get it. Then I drag off of that and grab player 2. From here, I grab the corresponding variables I'm going to need. Again, I need last stun frames received and last recovery frames. These are also variables that we set up in previous episodes regarding those startup, active, and recovery frames. But I can drag off of them and I can get last stun frames received. And I can get last recovery frames. Then I drag off player 2 and do the same thing. One more time, last recovery frames. Just like that. And that's what we've got here. Now, we need to determine what character we're displaying this advantage or disadvantage for. I'm always going to use the attacker as the one that is going to be displaying the advantage, whether I'm doing the binding or I'm doing our own function that we call onTakeDamage. The attacker, the one initializing the attack, in my opinion, is the one that has the advantage or the disadvantage. Technically, the character hit by the attack also has an advantage or disadvantage because it depends on if they finish and return to idle before their attacker does. But I think of the attacker as the one where the data needs to be present. So we do the same logic that we did in our other ones where we check to see if this widget is for P1, which sounds a little bit more complicated than it is. Really, it just means if it's on the left or right side currently, because the left side is always player 1 and the right side is always player 2. Even if they jump over each other and switch sides, the player on the left, you know, their health bar, their character, their title, all that, that's still player 1. Player on the right is player 2. We bring that into a branch, and then we have our return nodes for one case if it's player 1, another case if it's player 2. You'll have one return node by default in your binding. You might have copied it over from one of your other functions, so you might already have 2. But if you don't have 2, you only have 1, it's super simple to get another. You can just right click and type add return node. Click that and you'll get another one. It'll automatically be the appropriate return value based on what the binding is, so you don't have to worry about that either. Once you have 2 return nodes, have one path going to one return node, the other path going to the other return node. And now we should already have this data here. We have player 1 with their last recovery frames and their last stun frames received, and player 2 with their last stun frames received and their last recovery frames. We're going to subtract here, but we need to make sure we do this in the right order. Right now the lines are right on top of each other, so it can be a little bit confusing. So think about it logically. If we're player 1, what we need to do is check the recovery frames of the attack that we just used. This will be set because last recovery frames is the last attack we performed and how many recovery frames it took to return to idle. To know if we have advantage or disadvantage, we then have to determine how long the other player was stunned for. So for player 1, we have to take player 2's last stun frames received and subtract that. This is just integer minus integer right here, from player 1's last recovery frames. The stun frames dealt to the opponent versus the recovery frames for the attacker to go back to idle. If we subtract them in this order, we will always get our correct advantage or disadvantage number. Now the same is true for player 2. If player 2 is the attacker, we need to take player 1's last stun frames received and subtract from player 2's last recovery frames. Do that subtraction and we will always get the appropriate advantage and disadvantage for the other player, player 2. Now this last part here, again, you might have copied from one of your other bindings, but if you didn't, it's super easy. You can actually just drag an integer into the return node here. This return node is going to have a value of text because we're binding a text box. So you can just immediately convert them by doing this. Alternatively, if you want, you can get toText integer and you'll get the same node. Just plug this in and then plug your return values into your return nodes. Now your binding will work, and at this point you could be done with your advantage and disadvantage. You go into your practice mode and go into any stage you want. You will see that this does work. I can go up to my opponent and I can attack them. But did you notice for a second that the frame advantage was -34? Or if I happen to use another attack, it changes in the middle? It is a little bit weird. This is because the advantage is being determined every single frame, yet the stun and the recovery aren't determined on the same frame. The recovery for the move is being determined as soon as I use the move, based on our logic, and the stun for the move is being determined when we land the move, based on our logic. You could use this binding and still fix the issue. All you'd have to do is determine the startup active and recovery frames on take damage, not when the move was used. I do like the startup frames, active frames, recovery frames triggering when I use a move or a command regardless of if I land it. So for example, if I use it here, you can see all my frames for that move. And so this is an intentional choice by me. But if you don't care about that, you can just simply set the startup active and recovery on take damage only, and your problems will be solved. You can actually use this binding. However, like I said, for me, I didn't really want to do that. So what I did was I disconnected the binding. I don't want to actually do that. I want to have my own logic for how to determine the frame advantage. You technically could leave it plugged in. It doesn't matter because what we're going to do is go to that text box that had the binding here, and we're going to remove the binding, in which case we will just have a value here that is printing, and we'll have 0. So if we play the game currently, it's just always going to say 0 for frame advantage. It will be there, won't really cause any issues, but it's never going to calculate properly. So now let's go ahead and determine how we can set up method number 2. Going into the graph again, instead of using this binding, I'm going to close this tab now, I made a new function, and I called this determine frame advantage. So you can press plus function here to make a new function, and it will be the only function in here that we've made that isn't a binding. In here, I added a boolean for if it's player 1 or not. So I just added a new input parameter. Made sure the type was boolean, and I called it is player 1. I'll have this node here after doing all that. We essentially want to do the same logic that we were doing, but instead of treating it as a binding, we need to do this logic only when we're taking damage, or really only when we're dealing damage to an opponent. And instead of returning a value, we're going to actually set the text directly on our frame advantage text. So it's the same variable, the same text box here that we're setting text in, but we're going to manually set it instead of doing it based on a binding. So if you want, you could go back into your get frame advantage text, copy your logic and paste it in here, and then just move a few things around. But the short version is we're still getting our game mode reference. We're still going to grab player 1 and 2. We're still going to grab the stun frames and recovery frames and subtract them, then convert them to text for both players. The main difference is that we don't check if the widget is for player 1 or for player 2, like this boolean here, like we did in the binding. Instead, we pass it in, and I'll show you why that is in a second when we get into calling this function, and use that for the branch to determine which one we are actually going to set. So this is the main difference. I mean, if you look at them side by side now, they're essentially the same function. It's just that these aren't return nodes. I'm just setting the text directly. And also, the branch is going off of a boolean being passed into the function, as opposed to the boolean on the widget itself. So the good thing is the function is very, very similar. Now to get this end part here, since you don't have return nodes, what you actually want to do is grab your frame advantage text. That is why I said it should be a variable. And we can just get it, and then we can drag off of it and call set text, and it's going to have text in parentheses as well. So set text, text, and then you pass in the two texts. At this point, this function's already done, actually. It's very simple because it was very similar to the other one. The important part about this function, though, is that we can call it outside of the HUD, and it's not tied to the binding, so it's not always happening. We can determine when it's called and when we want to see it. Now, we're actually going to go to the code, because this is a code and blueprint project, and specifically we're going to go to where our characters take damage, and that is within my fighter template character.cpp and .h class. So I'm going to go to the fighter template character.h and add a new function, and it's basically just going to be the function to relay the data to the HUD to tell it to update this value. So I'm going to scroll down to where my functions are, and we had one called gather command data from table, and this was really useful for things like the startup, active, and recovery frames for that widget. So I wanted to follow the same type of direction that went in. And so I made a new function under it that is also a blueprint implementable event. Basically, we can call it in code, but we fill out the logic for it in the blueprint. And I'm calling it determine frame advantage HUD. HUD for heads up display. And basically what this does is what the comment says. It determines the frame advantage or disadvantage in practice and training mode. Go to the fighter template character.cpp. We can now go to our take damage function. That is where we will want to call this function. So here's take damage, and we have a lot of logic in here because a lot of things can happen when damage occurs. To be honest, none of the logic is really important for this episode. The only thing we care about is that where we call this function has to be after all the values will have been set. Remember what we specifically need for this mechanic. We need last stun frames received to be set, and we need last recovery frames. Last recovery frames will be set at this point because it is automatically set when the command is used. So basically we just have to make sure that last stun frames received is already set, in which case we can call the function. Now, last stun frames received is set differently based on if the character just takes the hit outright or if they block it. So instead of putting in any of these if-else statements, what I actually do is I scroll down toward the very bottom of the function and call it afterward. So regardless if it's a hit or a block, it's going to be called. We're going to determine the frame advantage / disadvantage for the character that landed the attack, even if it is blocked. So there we go. We're going to call the other player's determine frame advantage HUD function. The character taking damage is not the attacker. That is the character that was hit by the attack, or the character that blocked the attack. But either way, it's not the attacker. And so the other player, the attacker, is the one that we want to call determine frame advantage HUD on. If we call it here, we'll be good to fill out the actual logic in the blueprint to update our HUD value. So after this, build, relaunch the editor, whatever it is you need to do. Come into Unreal, and we're going to go to our child blueprint class of our character. This is my base character BP, so all my characters will be able to do this. My base character BP already has a HUD reference, so this is a good spot to do it. And the logic is really simple. We need to grab our event, and that is going to be our determine frame advantage HUD that we just set up. Once you click that, it's going to bring you here. Now we just have to use our pre-existing HUD reference. Get it? I check it for validity before using it, but you don't really have to. Drag off of it, and we're going to grab the data from the HUD that we want to update. So specifically, we want to update the frame data panel widgets that are on the HUD. Let's go back to the HUD for a second. You'll see that I have two variables, for P1 frame data panel and P2 frame data panel. Both of these are considered variables on the HUD. And so I will actually be able to grab them from the HUD reference because this is a base GM HUD object reference, which is where those variables were. So I can look up P1 frame data panel and P2 frame data panel, and we want to get both of them. And that's what I've done here. Now on each of them, we want to call determine frame advantage, which is that function we made in them, not the binding, but the actual function we made. And we want to pass in the appropriate data. So I do it a little bit more manually here, but it doesn't matter how you handle this, just as long as the correct widget has the correct Boolean set on it. So P1 frame data panel is player 1, P2 frame data panel is player 2. But I do an extra check just to make sure that we have the correct player here. This will be helpful as we get into switching sides as well. So if player 1 is actually starting on the right side, not the left side, we can know what player it is, and it won't be based on side alone, which, again, that's important because you actually will still have a player 1 and a player 2, and they might not be based on the actual side they're starting the match on. So I have an isPlayer1 Boolean in my character. I get that, bring that into a branch. Then I drag off my P1 frame data panel called determine frame advantage, and since I know that it is player 1, this is true, I want to set is player 1 to be true by checking the box. For the other case, I drag off P2 frame data panel, call my determine frame advantage, and I don't check the box because we're not player 1. We know we're player 2 in that case. Now I can compile and save. We're in our stage, and now I can attack my opponent, and I get actual frame advantage, and I only get it when the damage is dealt. At this point, you can play around with your hitbox data values as well as your command data values for your startup, active, and recovery. And you should set these for all your moves. Again, I've only set it for this one, but it doesn't matter. As long as you set it for each move, they will work. Feel free to play around with them and change them if you don't like the actual values that you're given. And at that point, you will have accurate frame advantage and frame disadvantage. There you go, guys. That's how you can set up frame advantage and disadvantage, and hopefully you also understand what it means now if you didn't before. You can actually plan around this and say if we have frame advantage, we know we're going to recover before the opponent, in which case I will be able to attack again even when mashing, and I can kind of lock them into that state. Now, of course, we'll want to fix this in combat flow. We won't want to allow the character to just infinitely loop against the opponent, but don't worry. That only happens because our frame advantage and frame disadvantage is working correctly. We know that if our frame advantage on our attacker is positive, then our attacker returns the idol before the character hit, and thus they are set up for combo potential. So this is super important for the future episodes. Anyway, guys, like I said, I hoped it helped you, and if it did, please subscribe. It does more for myself and the channel than anything else you can do, and I just really appreciate it. I want to give another shout out to my YouTube membership and Patreon members and supporters. Thank you guys for the love and support. Thank you for everything. I hope you're enjoying the series. If you had any issues with this tutorial or any of my tutorials, feel free to join the Discord community. I'd be happy to help you out, and it's completely free. Anyway, guys, that's all I got, so thank you so much for watching. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.